Okay, well, good evening, everyone, or good morning, or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Chris Martin. I am a diploma holder at WSET. I work at WSET. I'm the head of Educator Training, and I teach levels 1, 2, 3, and for a diploma, I teach fortified wine, in particular, the fortified wines of Portugal. And tonight we're going to look at one of those, which is port. So I saw that some of you have a glass of port with you, which is very nice. I've got a nice port here, which I'll talk about later on tonight. So you may see me sipping that. I'm also wearing my festive elf hat, which, you know, we have to keep something happy for 2020. So I'll take you through port, a little bit of the history, the region, some of the grapes, go through the different styles. For some of you, you know, decoding port labels can be slightly confusing. Hopefully by the end of this, it will be much clearer in terms of what each of these labels mean and the styles that you can expect from them. Then I'll end with a little bit about some of the trends that are happening in port, in terms of the port business, and then talk about some ways in which you can enjoy port. And as always, then we'll have just sort of 5 or 10 minutes towards the end, sometimes for questions. So if you do have any questions, if you were joined just after 6, Lydia will be in control of the group chat, so please write any of your questions there, and she will let me know what they are, and I will answer them hopefully at the end of the session. So without further ado, let us jump into port. So first off, what is port? Well, port is a fortified wine from Portugal. So fortified means that there has been the addition of spirit, so that it is over 15% alcohol, and we'll see that port is usually 19+% ABV, and I'll be talking about what that actually means when we go through some of the winemaking later this evening. So the history of port is a really interesting one, and it's one that is intricately tied with the relationship between England and Portugal, which has for a very long time had a connection, both politically and economically. In the 17th century, there were quite a number of wars and unpleasantries with France in particular, and England at the time was a large country, or a country that drank a large amount of Bordeaux wines and other French wines. With the wars going on, that supply of wine was cut off, but the British people needed their alcohol, they needed their sort of wines, and so they turned to Portugal. And it was in this time that we started to see a move towards Portuguese wine. There were 2 British missionaries who went to the abbots of Lamego, and they were in that area, and they basically discovered that this abbot was sort of creating this fortified wine, which they discovered was of a much higher quality than the still wines of Portugal. And so they started going, well, this is quite interesting. Let's start importing this, and so exporting this to the UK. And so you started to see at this time the birth of lots of these companies. If you look at lots of the names of port houses, you will notice that they have quite a English flair, shall we say. Taylor's, for example, Graham's, Dow, and so forth. There were other companies, obviously, Dutch and Portuguese themselves, which were also making these sorts of wines. But this really started sort of around this time. In 1703, the the British signed a treaty with the Portuguese, the Maturation Treaty. The key of this was really the lower rate of duty. So they gave the wines of Portugal an advantage over the other wines of the world. The British people being a particularly, shall we say, thrifty lot, thought, oh, we can get quite high levels of alcohol in our wine at relatively cheap prices. Port is the place to go. And there really was, after that, in the early 1700s, a massive expansion of ports, fortified ports, from Portugal going to the UK. As a result of this sort of massive demand, these lower taxes, there were a number of producers who were producing, shall we say, less than high quality wines. And as a result of that, potentially doing some damage to the Portuguese and the ports wine industry. So as a result of this lower quality, in 1756, a chap who was the Marquis de Pombal said, right, what we need to do is we're going to start making some rules about how to make port, what goes into it, where you can make it, certain laws and regulations. It is debatable from a historical point of view whether this was the first sort of IGP or PGI that sort of came into existence, PDO rather, which is protected designation of origin. But this is this sort of idea where you see AC in France, or the other sort of DO in Spain, and so on. The other country that sort of claims it was the first was Hungary in Tokai. But in any case, in 1756, the Marquis de Pombal said, right, we're going to make some rules. Port has to have these particular things. And as a result of that, the quality recovered and sort of went back into a more higher level quality range. Born from this idea, there were a number of regulatory bodies that came about in the 19th and early 20th century, which started to organize and sort of control more about the types of vineyards where the port was or the grapes were being grown, but also how much you could sell, what you could sell, the percentage of alcohol, where you had to buy the fortifying liquid that goes into it. There were a number of these particular things. When Portugal joined the EU in 1986, a number of those things were found to violate EU regulations, and in particular the sort of non-competition clauses and so forth. And they were essentially giving monopolies to certain companies. So lots of those were just torn apart, and then the Institute of Wine for Douro and Port, the IVDP, was created. This building here is a picture I took of it when I was there a few years ago. And the IVDP, since 2003, governed the production of port, selling port, and we'll talk about them as we go through the presentation today. So this is sort of just putting it a little bit into perspective about port. So where are we exactly? So here we are in Portugal. Here is Porto, the city itself, Oporto in Portuguese. We're 41, so we're just, this is the Atlantic over here. So we're getting lots of Atlantic influences and lots of cooling influences along here. It is very rainy in Oporto. It's similar type climate to Manchester in terms of the amount of rain. So Manchester, the UK, in terms of the amount of rain per year. Very, very rainy. However, if you go along the River Douro, along here, and then you come into the Douro itself, so there we've got these mountains here. So I'll show you some pictures of the sort of stunning vistas that you have here. This is where we have the production area of port. So in this area, this is where the port is being made. This is where the grapes are being grown. And what happens is then, and I'll talk about these particular ones, but essentially they start their life, a bottle of port will start its life out here. In the old days, it would travel down the river and then end up here at Vila Nova de Gaia, which is the city right opposite Porto. There's a lovely bridge that connects the two, where it would spend its life and mature until it was bottled and eventually sold. And we'll sort of track the life of a port as we go through it. So in the Dura Valley, which is this area here, you have a very, very warm climate. And it's relatively dry climate as well. So as you're going sort of further and further east, the climate becomes warmer and warmer, and the influences of the Atlantic become less and less as you go further over. So in here in the Baixo Corgo, you have about 900 milliliters of rain per year. In Cima Corgo, you have about 750, and in Douro Superior, you have around 440 milliliters per year. So the rain becomes less. So this is the very wet area, this is the sort of moderate one, and this is incredibly dry. Because this is protected by these mountains range here, it is a continental climate. So in summer, we're getting really hot, 40 degrees plus, that is 40 degrees Celsius. I have no idea what that is in Fahrenheit, but I imagine it's something in the 2000s or something. I don't understand Fahrenheit. In any case, it gets very warm, and then obviously in winter it gets very, very cold, so it does actually freeze. As a result of this, spring frosts can be an issue with some of the grape varieties that are grown there. Because Baixo Corgo is the wettest, it's got lots of disease pressure there. Douro Superior, because it's the driest, there's lots of drought pressure there. So Cima Corgo is sort of the happy in-between of these area. And if we go, if we go here, we sort of zoom in, you can see here how hilly the area really is. So this is Kinter de Naval in Pinau, which is just here in the center of Cima Corgo, just sort of a bit up here in the mountains. You've got this altitude, and the altitude obviously is adding a cooling influence. But not only is it a cooling influence, as you can see here from this morning mist, we're above the fog line in some cases. So here, there's still some fog here, but what this picture belies is that there's actually this slope goes up and up and up here, and those are very much above the fog line there. So the sunlight, you're getting lots of sun. The direction, you can see here how sort of in this distance, how hilly and circular it is. So even in one sort of, and we'll talk about these terraces in a moment, even within one of these, you're getting lots of sun on one part, and you turn the corner and there's no sun. So planting, when we get to grapes, is important in this case. So this is a very sort of typical view. There's a Kinter down here. So Kinter, when I say this is the farms essentially that are growing the grapes. So these are all the grapes along here. So let us move on. So as I said with these slopes, the issue with the slopes is, well, how are we going to grow the grapes there? So the soil itself in here, you can see perhaps if you've zoomed in, the sort of rocky nature of the slopes here, especially here, and in this case, there is granite soils which are very, very hard and very difficult for the plants to grow on. You then have schist, which is much easier for the grapes and the roots to go down. So planting densities can vary by site. But obviously then what you have to think is, once you've identified, okay, here's the soil that I need, then you think, okay, well, how the heck am I going to grow grapes on this very, very, very steep slope? And this historical way of creating terraces was started way, 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 way back when. So what they did in the first case here were these brick or stone walls that you can see here, hopefully on with my laser pointer. And to go between them, these are the steps that go between these terraces. These are now protected by the UNESCO, which is the World Heritage Site. So if anything were to happen to any of these, they can't be destroyed, they have to be repaired. Now, you can imagine that, as you see here, in this case, we are very far away from Porto. This area is relatively rural. And as is the case not only in Portugal, but around the world, there is an urbanization that's happening. So labor that would have been easily available 20, 30, 50, 100, 200 years ago have moved out of this area. So the upkeep of these walls are incredibly expensive. And because they are protected as a World Heritage Site, they have to be constantly preserved. So some of the sites that they have them, these producers, if they own them, going, this is too much, and they're selling, there's lots of this selling off to larger grape growers, larger producers, so that they're able to preserve these very beautiful and historic terraces. You see here, there's about 2 rows of vines. In this case, there's 3, and then there's 2 down here, and then it goes to 1. They are relatively compact. You can get about 6,000 vines per hectare. But as you can imagine, sort of mechanizing this is particularly challenging. So it requires a lot of labor, which is expensive and difficult to come by. So they created another system, which is similar to this, but essentially they would just take the stones that were lying about and sort of make these terraces like this, which you can see even here in the distance. And this bit here, if you see that, that's a road that cuts through those so that they're able to access them with small tractors and with these sort of large rubbery things, so that it cuts down on the amount of labor that's required. So you'll see a move with newer sites and some of the other sites that don't have these to this type of trellising. You'll also see this type of trellising, which is used more in the Douro Superior. This one is when it's particularly sort of steep, and as you can see, they essentially are coming down the hill rather than across the hill like that. And if you ever get the chance, after this disastrous nonsense about this virus, to go traveling, I highly recommend the Douro. It's beautiful. If you come along the train, you can take a train from Porto to Pinhão. It takes a long time. You can also drive there, but if you take the train, you go along the river, and once you go through, it is absolutely a sight to behold. So I just want to talk a little bit about the grape varieties that we see in Porto and in the Douro. There are over 100 grape varieties that are grown here. Lots of them are unique to the Dura Valley. Some of them are unique to this area. Some of them, as we'll see, are common around the world. Though there are a massive number of them, there are a particular handful, these 5 here, that are used the most common in blends. So these are the ones that you will see in red ports, and we'll talk a little bit about white ports. Some of you may not know that port does make white port, and it is absolutely delicious port, and we'll talk a bit about that. This, by the way, is not a white port. So Tarouga Franca is the workhorse, essentially, of Porto and the Dura Valley. It is late ripening. It needs heat to ripen. So you will see it on the hottest sites, which is really convenient because the majority of sites in the Dura Valley are particularly hot. So you're going to see this in Cima Corgo a lot in terms of its planting. It is incredibly vigorous, so it produces a lot. It adds color, it adds tannin, it adds acidity to the blends. So it really is adding all of those components that we need for high quality ports. By the way, I know that there were a few people from Brazil, and I imagine some from Portugal as well. I apologize in advance for the butchering of your marvelous language. But here we have Tinta Rojas, which is also known as Tempranillo, which you may know from Rioja in Spain. Here, this is adding body and color. This is a relatively early ripening grape variety, and so therefore needs a slightly cooler site. So you'll see this on the really high altitude parts of planting. Then you have Tinta Barroca. Again, this is early ripening, so you need the cool sites. What the cool sites do is they slow down the ripening process so that the grapes are able to develop flavor and concentration and not just develop sugars and then no flavors to them. Again, this one, because it's so early ripening, it needs the cooler sites. And so you'll often see this one in Baixo Corgo. Here, it doesn't really add much of the floral flavors to a wine. Here, you're going to add lots of the earthy flavors, sort of the more meaty flavors. It's relatively lower in acidity, but the advantage is it's high yielding. So if you have a site that is particularly high in altitude or particularly cool, this is your go-to grape. Tarouga Nacional, some of you may have wondered, why did I not start with Tarouga Nacional? Well, Tarouga Franca these are the sort of in order of the percentage of plantings. And Tarouga Nacional is actually relatively low in terms of hectares in which it's planted. But Tarouga Nacional is the grape that people think of when they think of port. It has high acidity, it has high tannins, it has well-pronounced, deep flavors of blackberry, cassis, black plum, lots of these black fruit flavors. It is incredibly thick-skinned, so it's also adding color to the wine. This is the grape that you're going to see in the majority of vintage ports, or in very high-end ports like that. And indeed, the Nacional name itself is also the name of Kinter de Naval, which is the wine I'm not drinking a Nacional, I wish I were, of their single Kinter vintage, which I'll talk about shortly. You have Tinta Chao. This is a relatively low yielding, late ripening grape variety, but with high levels of acidity. So when a port producer is looking at making a blend or making a port, lots of the choices they're thinking about is, okay, where are these grapes coming from? What are they adding? Do I want to make a more floral style, a more earthy style? Do I want acidity for longevity? Do I want something lower acidity for more easy drinking, early release? These are the decisions they're taking into account. Again, there are a number of white grape varieties. The two most important ones here are Malvasia fina. Also, this is the grape variety that's confusingly also found in another part of Portugal, the island of Madeira, in the style of Madeira called Boal. Not in the Malvasia style of Madeira. That's another discovering workshop we can do. But this one here is medium acids, full-bodied. It has a slightly honeycomb note to it. It's a really lovely type wine. Then we have this Muscatel, which I'm not even going to try to butcher the name of, but this is Muscatel Blanca Petit Grand, which is the one that you will find in other types of Muscat, Muscat Bon de Venise. Very aromatic grape variety. Again, you'll find these and many others around the production, or grown in the area rather. So when people think of port, I think the thing that comes to mind, the image that comes to mind, is the image of all the sort of local children, maybe some of the younger teenagers, some of the young ladies in sort of shorts stomping on grapes. And that's the image that we have of sort of this big festival of everyone stomping on the grapes. And that does happen up to a certain extent. But what I want to talk about is, unfortunately, alas, I don't have a picture of that marvelous event, but I do have the sort of picture of where this happens in the sort of more modern version. So when fortification happens with anything, but with port in particular, what we're doing is we're interrupting the fermentation. So the fermentation, the yeast is slowly eating the sugars and producing alcohol. At a certain point, we want to add the fortifying liquid, so we stop that, therefore doing a number of things. We are increasing the alcohol, not through any fermentation process, but rather through this addition of fortifying liquid. And what we're also doing here is we're allowing there to be some residual sugar left over, because there's sugar that the yeasts are unable to eat because we've essentially killed them with this fortifying liquid. What happens during fermentation for red wine is a number of very complicated things, but what's happening is an extraction of flavor and an extraction of color. So if you actually stop the fermentation, the color could be not as deep as we want it, or it could not, we might not be getting the aromatics that we want from the wine. So in order to maximize this extraction of aromatic flavors and tannins, which are important in certain vintages, as well as all of these, as well as color, what they do is they did this trodding of the grapes. And this was done in this thing called the lagares. And this is one here that's made of granite. And what would happen is, historically, they would do something. This is made of granite, and you can't see, but inside here, this is not a smooth granite. It's a rough granite. So the grapes, as they're being stomped upon, are hitting and abrasing against the granite here and cracking open. The skin and the juices coming out of the skin, and that then starts this extraction process. The human foot is a very gentle thing, and so stomping up and down on it breaks the skin against this granite surface here, but is not breaking the seeds of the grape. And that's important because the seeds of those grapes have very, 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 very bitter compounds that are undesirable in any finished wine. So the stomping of the grapes had this purpose of starting this extractive process before any fermentation happens, so that when the fortification happens, there was a maximization of color, tannins, and aroma. As I mentioned, people are leaving the Dura Valley, so the number of people available, or the number of feet, shall we say, that are available have decreased. So lots of producers are resulting, unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, just this is the nature of it, to these robotic ones. And this is what you see here. So this is also, this is Kinter de Noval as well. In fact, this is, for those of you who are interested, this is indeed the exact Lagares where they make their Nacional. These pistons here have on the bottom this sort of round rubber foot. And what happens is you can see that this metal bit here, this basically goes up and down and up and down, and these pistons imitate the stomping of the grapes. So the grapes will come in through, where's my mouse? Through the doors here. They'll be dumped into this vat, and then this will start pressing them down, starting that extractive process. This is a very fancy piece of kit in this case. But this is a sort of version that other producers use in different formats, and other producers have created different versions of these robotic ones in this case. You then, at about 5 to 7%, once it starts fermenting, when it's about 5 or 7% ABV, so very low alcohol strength, so there's quite a lot of sugar left over, we fortify the wine by adding a type of spirit, a grape spirit called aguardente, which is 77% ABV. Now, you may think 77%, my goodness, that's very strong. But in the world of spirits, a distilled spirit at 77% is actually what we call a low-strength spirit. And low-strength spirits are very pronounced in flavor. For example, if you had a cognac, this is an aside, a cognac versus a vodka. So those are two different strengths. A cognac's coming off at about 75 to 80% ABV. When it goes into barrel, obviously then it's diluted. But a vodka is at 95 to 96%, which is then diluted down to 40%. So you can imagine that what they're adding here is more the sort of cognac brandy style rather than the vodka style that you would see in other styles or other categories of fortified wines. So what's important with this step of fortification is the quality of that aguardente. If it is very low quality, then that's going to impact the style of the wine. If it's high quality aguardente, then it's going to obviously, because you're going to be able to taste it. Because we are fortifying it at 5 to 7%, and we are producing a spirit that's between 18 to 20%, well, really 19 to 21% ABV. What this roughly means is that for every 1 liter of spirit, you need 4 liters of must, of wine must. So in a bottle, it's nearly around 20% of a bottle of port. Here's a bottle of port. Quite a chunk of it is spirit. So the quality of that is very important. So in any case, the wine, it goes in here. We are fortifying it. Then we take it off and we'll stick it into, depending on what the style that the producer wants to make from that particular wine. They'll stick it into some barrels, so either small barrels or large barrels. This is one of my favorite expressions, I think, which is that the wine overwinters in the Dura Valley. Because the Douro is quite cold, as we said, in winter, it spends the winter there, or overwinters. There, I would like to overwinter in the Caribbean, but alas, that's not possible. But in any case, they stay there, and then what happens is they then will travel to Vila Nova de Gaia, where they will continue their maturation, and that starts in the spring of the following year. So the key to fortified wines is in the process in which it's matured. So what I want to do next is to walk through the different styles of ports that we have in Porto. So essentially, we have two broad styles here. Ruby styles are more in a sort of red ruby style, and tawny is a slightly more oxidative, sort of more brown tawny style. And I'll go through each of these and highlight some of the main points as we go through. These are roughly in order of quality level. So the basic or starter or entry level is our ruby port here. These ruby ports are generally going to be made in a very sort of easy to drink style. So the tannins will probably be more towards the medium. We're not going to be using our high quality grapes in this case. Very little, if any, Toruga Nacional is going to be going in here. We'll probably have some Toruga Franca or Tinta Jorges, depending obviously on what we want. The idea here is protective winemaking, you know, maybe 2-3 years, and then it goes out to market. And they're very sort of affordable, easy to drink expressions of them. If we leave them a little bit longer in the barrel, there is no minimum for the Ruby Reserve, but if we want to leave it in there for maybe 4 or 5 years, maybe introduce some some light oxidative character in there, it gets a bit more depth of character, slightly turned up in terms of the tannins, the acidity, and so forth, then this is released as a Ruby Reserve. Again, each of the different ports, importers and exporters, will have their own different ways of making this. They'll have their own blends. There are certain rules and regulations about how much port can be sold in a year, and I'll talk a bit about that as we go through. Important though to note that these two styles, Ruby and Ruby Reserve, are non-vintage products. So this means that it is a blend of different years. The idea of that is that there is a consistency of brand. When you go and you buy your Coburn's Ruby Reserve, or you go and buy your Grimm's 6 grapes, it should always roughly be the same quality year in, year out. The first vintage character that we have is late bottle vintage. This was created as a sort of marketing ploy because people see a vintage and they think, oh, vintage, that must mean good. All it means is that it is from that single year. It has to spend 4 to 6 years in woods. It generally avoids oxidation. There might be some oxidative elements to it. It has got sort of medium plus, so sort of, you know, relatively not super high, but medium plus tannins, medium plus acidity, fairly pronounced, but we're not sort of in the land of really sort of overly aromatic or complex in that case. You can get some LBVs that are bottles, unfined and unfiltered. This is a sort of trends. The idea being that then it will evolve a little bit and develop a little bit in bottle. These lack the concentration and depth that you will find in a vintage port. However, they are still from a particular single year. You can also find that some of these are then aged in bottle for a bit before they're released. But generally, when you get a Ruby Reserve or an LBV, those are meant for sort of, they have done the aging. You don't need to age it for it. Go forth and drink. Crusted port is again a non-vintage port. It spent a maximum of 2 years in wood, so not quite as much as LBV. And here it nearly made it to vintage, but wasn't quite good enough, but was a little bit better than LBV. But maybe we need to sort of put a little blending to it. This is unfiltered and unfined. So when you unfilter a wine before you bottle it, or when you fine a wine before you bottle it, essentially what you're doing is you're removing all the solid bits. So you may have got a red wine that has got sort of some sediment to it. That is because it hasn't been as fined as some of the other wines. This crusted port, when you drink it, it's what it calls as throws a crust, which is that sort of thick red line of sort of tannins and anthocyanins and all that delicious, yummy stuff. So this you can bottle age for a bit. Vintage, I'm just going to skip over a single Kinter here. Vintage is the pinnacle of the pinnacle. This is your top grapes. This is mostly going to be, not always, but it's going to be very heavy on Toruga Nacional, the grape variety that's super, everything is turned up to 11 in terms of acid, in terms of tannins, in terms of flavor and concentration. You might get some Toruga Franca in there as well. But essentially you've got this wine, and after about 2 years after harvest, you have to then decide, is this wine going to become a vintage wine? And you have to then declare it with the IVDP and say, Mr. and Mrs. IVDP, this barrel or these barrels are going to become our vintage. We want to declare this year as a vintage year. So you will find some producers in some years, for example, 2011 and 2016, nearly every single producer declared a vintage. They went, yep, we're going to do it. In some other years, for example, 2015, some of the producers said, we don't really have a vintage product. Some of them said, oh yeah, we've got a vintage product, we're going to declare one. So the reason why they would or would not declare a vintage port is partly, is the quality of the wine good enough? But also, is there lots of vintage port already on the market? If there's lots of vintage port already in the market because you just launched one the year before, is it good business to suddenly say, oh, we've got a better one this year? So again, it's one of those ones where not everyone declares, but some producers do declare quite a lot. But again, there's lots of factors that go into it. These are the ones that then spend 3 years maximum in wood. They are then bottled, and they are aged in bottle. So in bottle, they then start to develop lots of tertiary and complex flavors. Ruby Reserve, LBV, crusted up to a point, but these ones are not really meant for long bottle aging. They have done the aging for you. If you have those ones sitting in your storeroom, best open them up. I mean, I think best open up anything nowadays. It's 2020. Single Kinter is a vintage port, essentially, that comes from a single Kinter, but perhaps may not be good enough to become a vintage. but it still has a depth of flavor to it. The reason why they may decide to say it's a single Kinter or a vintage depends on the quality, it depends on the producer, it depends on market demands. Tawny styles of ports are slightly more tawny in color, so that's a slightly browny ambery color. And again, we have tawny reserve, we have some other ones here. So tawny, your sort of bog standards tawny is no older than some of these ruby styles that we have up here. How they've been made is perhaps with a slightly lighter extraction. So maybe the grape weren't able to extract that much color to it. So it was a bit lighter in color. And this is where then you get this tawny one. Tawny reserve, this is 6 years in oak. Again, these are blended. And again, it's going to perhaps start having some oxidative notes to it. So you're going to start getting some coffee notes to it as well. Tawny with an indication of age. So this is your 10-year-old, 20-year-old, 30-year-old, or 40-year-old. I am having, if you can see that, a 20-year-old Naval, which is a tawny. This is not, if you're a whiskey drinker, the rules are quite different. This is not the youngest ports in there. This is an indication of style. So what does a 10-year-old port taste like? Well, a 10-year-old tawny port tastes like what the IVDP say a 10-year-old tawny port should taste like. Essentially, you as a port producer create your port. You say, this tastes like a 10-year-old tawny. You go to the IVDP and say, I think this is what it tastes like. They go, huzzah, that's what it is. And then you can sell it. Or they go, no, this isn't a 10-year-old tawny. You need to go in and tinker with the blend again. So again, that's 10, 20, 30, 40. These are essentially blends of Coyeta. And these, you can think of a Coyeta as a sort of vintage tawny port. So if you remember, at 2 years, so we put this wine into a barrel. At 2 years, the producer says, this is going to be a vintage, this is going to not be a vintage. If it's not going to be a vintage, it continues its life in barrel. And then it could be at around 4 or 6 years, it says, okay, now we're going to make a decision. Are we going to make an LBV from it? Perhaps the color is a little bit off. Perhaps they might say, no, we're going to make a tawny reserve. Or they say, no, we're just going to leave this in barrel for a really, really, really long time. And this is then when you get this single vintage Coyeta. They are a minimum of 7 years old. Essentially, they are just sitting in barrel aging. So there's lots of oxidation that's happening. There's lots of this process of going in and out of the wood and concentration of lots of things. To give you an indication, here is a port tasting that I did. This was a 2018, so that was the year in which I went. White port. This was a 2007 port. This was a 2007 blended 10-year-old port. And this port, if you can see the date there, was 1940. That port is white, even though it is fairly dark in color. So that's just an indication of what happens to white port. So you can imagine a similar sort of process happening, though with a slightly different color gradation to red port. When a Coyeta is bottled, you need to have 2 dates on it. You need to have the date of the vintage and the date it was bottled. If you have a Coyeta at home, the aging, or if you have a tawny with an indication of age, the aging has already been done for you. You know, this wine, 20-year-old tawny port, is meant for drinking now. If I age this for 10 years, I do not have a 30-year-old tawny port. What I have is a 10-year-old, 20-year-old tawny port, which is not going to be as nice as it is right now. So really, with the exception of sort of perhaps crusted single Kinter and vintage, ports is meant for when you buy it, you drink it. It's not meant for additional aging, because it's not going to get better in bottle. It's not going to get perhaps worse, but it's not going to improve. So, you know, if you've spent the money on a nice 30 or 40-year-old tawny, go for it, drink it, why not? So I am just suddenly aware of the time. I just want to speed through a little bit of some of the port trends, and then just end with some of the fun ways in which we can enjoy port. One of the big trends is port and, port as it is being used in cocktails. Port has attempted to reposition itself slightly, as opposed to sitting on a wine shelf where 20% when it's sitting next to perhaps a Muscatel at 12%, and at now 20% for port appears really high alcohol. They're repositioning themselves on the spirit aisle, where when you're sitting next to a gin, which is at maybe 42%, suddenly 20% is a light drink. So using it in cocktails counterintuitively is appealing to that lower alcohol trends that we're seeing in the booze industry. One of the cocktails which, if you had joined when I was chatting to Lydia earlier, is port and tonic. White port and tonic is a wonderful drink in summer or on any day. Fever Tree, which is one of the large producers of tonic, made a sort of partnership with Coburn's Fine White rather, and in the UK we're sort of selling the two side by side as a lighter alternative to gin and tonic, and I have to say it's really quite scrumptious. Pink port is, or rosé port is a style of port that Crofts sort of created in the 2000s. You'll see it in a white bottle. It's very pink. It's essentially tawny port, or ruby port that has had very little extraction, but now is marketed in a way for, ooh, rosé. We all love rosé. Different size bottles. So down here you will see a normal bottle of port, and up here you will see a rather ridiculous bottle of port. Unfortunately, I wish I could have had the two side by side. This bottle fits 6 of these inside it. This is theatre. You know, Graham's did this. I don't know if you can see this date here on your computer, but this is a 1982. Which for the royalists who are joining us was the year, I believe, William was born. They released this for they released a 1982 Coyetta for his wedding with Kate, and then William, the brother Harry, liked it so much that when Harry got married to Meghan, they re-released it. So this is a wonderful case of here. This is a Coyetta from 1982, but if you had that 1982 in 2012, and then you had it in whenever they got married, what was it, 2017 or something, even though it's the same vintage, the same year, it's a different bottling date, it tasted differently. And these big bottles, you know, if you go to a restaurant and someone orders a glass of port and this massive bottle comes out and it's poured, there's a sense of theatre to it, and more people then start buying it. Seasonal gifts, obviously port this is the season for port. And vintage port, you know, it still continues to be, probably to a lesser degree, among a certain class of people, sort of the gift you buy a case of for your you know, your daughter or your son for when they turn, you know, 18, 19, 20, or whenever they leave the house, and you can celebrate, or give it to them. So anyway, port for the holiday season. Again, as I said, port and tonic, why not start the way with that? With white tonic, I would go for a slightly more sweeter style of white tonic. Sorry, of white port. Coburn's, Kids de Naval do a nice one. Taylor's dry ports, to me, it doesn't have quite it doesn't work so well for the tonic, but to each their own. Obviously, Stilton is the classic pairing, but you know, I think a 10-year-old goes really nicely with some Comté cheese. 20-year-old with some Parmesan and Manchego, a bit more sort of oomph to it. And I had this in the restaurants. I can't recall where, somewhere in the States. Whereas a 40-year-old with grilled mango and coconut ice cream. It's oddly specific, I know, but if you ever get the chance, highly recommend it. Absolutely scrumptious. Tawny ports, generally I would serve slightly chilled. I think port is often, the temperature of it slightly over warm, which just exacerbates the alcohol. Obviously, you can have it with dessert. Cooking with port, I don't mean having a glass while you're cooking. I mean, obviously, you know, 'tis the season. But here, it's actually adding it as a sort of way of deglazing. If you cook, you know, soups, adding a bit of sort of white port or some of the tawny ports, just sort of liven it in a way that perhaps just cooking with a regular cheap white or red wine don't do. Experiment. Try something new. Or just enjoy a glass. Anyway, I hope that has been useful and enjoyable. We have sort of sped through the world of ports. Hopefully I've disentangled some of it for you. I realize that there's only 2 minutes left, which is a clever, cunning ploy of mine. Not at all, it's just I have bad time management. So Lydia, if you want to ask me any of the questions that were asked, or what we want to do.
Hello, Chris. Thank you so much for that. Sorry, I was just rapidly typing away answering some of the questions. So I think I managed to get through most of them on the chat. But equally, if anyone has any further questions, then please do feel to pop them in now. I think I managed to get to all of them while you were talking. So thank you so much for that, Chris. There's lots of thank yous coming through now. So thank you so much.
Yes, yeah, you're quite welcome. You're quite welcome.
And I'm so impressed that your elf hat managed to stay in position throughout.
Well, I know at one point I was going to rip it off, but I thought, you know, might send the wrong message.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for that. And yes, the recording will be, if anyone missed anything and wants to catch up, the recording will be available on our YouTube channel.